"Dad, Vanessa thinks it would be better if you didn't come to Sunday dinners anymore," my son Stephen said, and those 13 words destroyed 42 years of the closest father-son relationship you could imagine. I'm Harold Mitchell, 68 years old, and I'd spent the last 3 decades being the kind of father who dropped everything when his son needed help. Emergency babysitting, financial support, home repairs, career advice. I was Stephen's go-to person for everything, until he married Vanessa 6 months ago. Now apparently I was the problem. If you've ever watched your own child choose a manipulative partner over the parent who sacrificed everything for them, you know exactly how it feels when your heart breaks and your anger ignites at the same exact moment. But this story isn't just about a son choosing his new wife over his father. This is about what happens when that father decides to teach them both a lesson they'll never forget about the true cost of betrayal. Let me start from the beginning, because the details matter when you're about to watch someone's perfect new life collapse like a house of cards. Stephen had been single for 4 years after his divorce from Emma's mother. As a successful architect, he had his pick of women, but he'd always been cautious about introducing anyone new to his 6-year-old daughter. Emma was the light of both our lives, and Stephen was determined not to bring anyone into her world unless he was absolutely certain about their character. Then he met Vanessa at a charity fundraiser 8 months ago. Vanessa Chen was everything Stephen thought he wanted. Beautiful, sophisticated, well-educated and charming in that practiced way that should have been a red flag but somehow never is. She was a marketing director at a tech company, drove a luxury car, and had the kind of polished confidence that made everyone assume she must be successful at everything she touched. From the first family dinner where Stephen introduced her to Emma and me, something felt off. Not obviously wrong. Vanessa was perfectly polite, appropriately interested in Emma, and respectful to me as Stephen's father. But there was a calculation behind her warmth, a sense that every smile and every comment was carefully crafted for maximum effect. If you've ever met someone who seemed almost too perfect in social situations, you understand that feeling when your gut tells you something doesn't match what your eyes are seeing. But Stephen was completely smitten. Within 3 months, Vanessa had moved into his house. Within 6 months, they were married in a small ceremony that cost Stephen nearly $30,000, money I'd actually helped him budget for what was supposed to be Emma's college fund. The changes in Stephen started almost immediately after the wedding, but they were subtle at first. He became less available for our usual weekly dinners. Emma seemed more reserved when she visited, mentioning that Vanessa had rules about screen time, bedtime routines, and even which toys were appropriate for a well-behaved young lady. But I didn't realize how completely Vanessa had poisoned Stephen against me until that conversation 3 weeks ago. "Dad," Stephen had said, shifting uncomfortably in his kitchen, while Vanessa smiled supportively from across the room, "we need to talk about boundaries." Boundaries. In 42 years of being Stephen's father, we'd never needed to discuss boundaries. I'd been the one who taught him to drive, helped him through college, supported him through his divorce, and been his primary co-parent for Emma when her mother moved to California for work. "What kind of boundaries?" I asked, already sensing this conversation was going to be painful. "Vanessa and I have been talking, and we feel like sometimes you're a little too involved in our family decisions." Our family decisions. Stephen was talking about his new family with Vanessa, and apparently I wasn't part of it anymore. "Can you give me an example?" I asked carefully. Stephen glanced at Vanessa, who nodded encouragingly. "Well, like last week when Emma was upset about her math homework, and you offered to help her. Vanessa thinks it's important that Emma learns to work through academic challenges without always having an adult rescue her. I'd been helping Emma with homework since she was 4 years old. It was one of our special traditions. She'd sit at my kitchen table after school, and we'd work through whatever was giving her trouble. She loved those sessions, and they'd helped her become an excellent student. I wasn't rescuing her, I said. I was spending time with my granddaughter and helping her learn." "That's exactly what Vanessa means," Stephen said, his voice taking on that patient tone people use when they think you're not understanding something obvious. "You see it as helping, but Emma needs to develop independence. She can't always run." to grandpa when things get difficult. If you've ever had your lifelong relationship with your grandchild criticized by someone who'd known her for less than a year, you'll recognize the surge of protective anger I felt. But I kept my voice calm. "Stephen, I've been part of Emma's life since the day she was born. I think I understand what she needs." "See, that's the problem," Vanessa interjected smoothly. "Harold, you're such a loving grandfather, but sometimes loving parents have to make decisions that might seem harsh to grandparents. Stephen and I need to present a united front in raising Emma. A united front against me, the man who'd been Stephen's co-parent for 6 years while he rebuilt his life after his divorce. And there's another thing," Stephen continued, clearly uncomfortable, but pushing forward. "We think it might be better if Emma stayed with us on the weekends instead of spending so much time at your house." Emma had spent every Saturday night at my house for 4 years. We had our routines: Saturday morning cartoons, pancakes for breakfast, trips to the park or the library, and movie nights with popcorn. It was the highlight of my week and, I'd thought, one of Emma's favorite traditions. "Why?" I asked, though. I was already dreading the answer. "Vanessa thinks Emma needs more structure and consistency. All the back and forth between houses, different rules, different bedtimes. It's confusing for a child her age. I use the same bedtime routine you do. Emma goes to sleep at the same time at my house. But you let her stay up late on Friday nights to watch movies," Vanessa said, "and you give her ice cream before dinner sometimes. And last month you took her shopping and bought her that expensive art set without checking with Stephen first. The art set had cost $40, and Emma had been talking about wanting to try watercolor painting for weeks. Watching her face light up when we found the perfect set at the craft store had been worth every penny. She's my granddaughter," I said. "I've been buying her gifts and treating her to special things her entire life. But now she has a stepmother who's trying to establish consistent boundaries," Vanessa replied. "When you undermine those boundaries, it makes parenting much more difficult for Stephen and me." Undermine. I was undermining their parenting by loving my granddaughter the same way I'd been loving her for 6 years. That's when Stephen delivered the final blow. "Dad, we think it would be best if you took a step back from some of the day-to-day parenting decisions. You've been incredibly helpful, especially during the divorce, but Vanessa and I are a team now. We need space to build our own family traditions, without me." I looked at my son, the boy I'd raised largely. Alone after his mother died when he was 12, the young man I'd supported through college and career struggles, the father I'd helped become the man he was, and realized that Vanessa had successfully convinced him that his own father was a threat to his new marriage. If you've ever felt the unique pain of being rejected by your own child in favor of someone who's known them for less than a year, you understand why I left Stephen's house that night, feeling like I'd lost my son forever. But I hadn't lost him forever. I'd just learned who he really was when forced to choose between loyalty and convenience. And I was about to teach both Stephen and Vanessa a lesson about what happens when you bite the hand that's been feeding you for decades. The war for my family was about to begin, and neither Stephen nor Vanessa had any idea they were about to face an opponent who'd spent 40 years in business learning how to destroy people who betrayed their partners. Over the next few days, I did something I'd never done before. I took a long, hard look at exactly how much of Stephen's comfortable life had been subsidized by his father's generosity. What I discovered was going to shock them both. For the past 6 years since Stephen's divorce, I'd been providing what economists call invisible support, financial assistance so seamlessly integrated into his life that he'd stopped noticing it was happening. The emergency funds when his architecture firm hit slow periods, the loans that never got repaid, the house down payment I'd helped with, the car I'd co-signed for, Emma's private school tuition that I'd been splitting with him. When I added it all up, I'd provided over $200,000 in direct financial support, plus countless hours of free childcare, home maintenance, and other services that would have cost him thousands more if he'd had to pay market rates. Stephen's comfortable middle-class lifestyle wasn't the result of his success as an architect. It was the result of having a father who'd been quietly subsidizing his life for years. But that was about to change, because while Vanessa was busy convincing Stephen that I was an over-involved father who needed boundaries, she'd overlooked one crucial detail. Over-involved fathers tend to be the kind of men who keep detailed financial records, maintain relationships with excellent attorneys, and have very long memories when it comes to betrayal. The first phase of my response was going to be purely financial, and it was going to hit them exactly where Vanessa's materialistic priorities would hurt the most, but that was just the beginning. Because I'd also started to investigate exactly who Vanessa Chen really was, and what I was discovering was going to destroy her carefully constructed image as the perfect wife and stepmother. Vanessa thought she'd successfully isolated Stephen from his father and claimed his loyalty for herself. She was about to learn that she'd made the worst tactical error of her manipulative life. The man she'd dismissed as an interfering old father was actually a strategic thinker who'd built a successful engineering consulting firm by always being 10 steps ahead of his competition. And she'd just declared war on someone who had both the resources and the motivation to completely destroy her world. If you've ever wondered what happens when someone who's used to being underestimated finally decides to show their true capabilities, this story is about to give you a masterclass in calculated revenge. Stephen and Vanessa were about to discover that some battles should never be started, because the person you're fighting might be far more dangerous than you ever imagined. The Monday morning after Stephen told me I wasn't welcome at Sunday dinners anymore, I drove to my attorney's office with a briefcase full of financial records that told the story of 6 years of invisible generosity. What I was about to do would teach both Stephen and Vanessa a harsh lesson about gratitude, but more importantly, it would reveal exactly what kind of person Vanessa really was when the money stopped flowing. James Morrison had been my business attorney for 20 years, and he'd also handled my personal legal affairs since my wife Margaret died 8 years ago. When I spread the documentation across his conference table, James whistled low. "Harold, I had no idea you'd been supporting Stephen to this extent." The numbers were staggering when laid out systematically. The house down payment I'd contributed, $45,000. The car loan I'd co-signed when Stephen's credit was damaged during his divorce. $18,000 remaining balance. Emma's private school tuition that I'd been paying half of, $8,000 per year for 3 years. The emergency loans that had never been repaid, $32,000 over various crises, but those were just the obvious expenses. When I calculated the market value of services I'd provided, childcare, home maintenance, financial consulting, legal advice referrals, the total economic value of my support over 6 years exceeded $300,000. If you've ever wondered what happens when someone takes your generosity for granted for so long that they forget it's generosity and start treating it as their right, you're about to find out. "What's your goal here, Harold?" James asked. "Do you want to demand repayment of the loans?" "I want to withdraw all financial support immediately and permanently," I said. "Every co-signed loan, every ongoing payment, every service I provide. It all stops today, and I want to make sure it's done in a way that's completely legal and above board." James reviewed the documentation carefully. "The co-signed car loan is tricky. You can't just remove yourself without Stephen's credit qualifying him to refinance independently, but everything else is straightforward. You can stop making voluntary payments immediately. What about the house down payment? That was a gift, legally speaking, unless you have documentation showing it was intended as a loan." I smiled. "Actually, I do have that documentation. Stephen signed a promissory note acknowledging it as a loan to be repaid when he sold the house or refinanced. I just never enforced the terms because I didn't want to pressure him while he was rebuilding his life after the divorce." James looked impressed despite himself. "You documented a $45,000 loan that Stephen probably forgot he signed?" "Stephen thought it was a gift because I never mentioned repayment. But Vanessa is about to discover that my generosity always came with legally binding terms, just in case my son ever decided to choose a manipulative wife over his father." The beauty of my position was that everything I was about to do was completely legal, ethically justified, and financially devastating to Stephen's comfortable lifestyle. He'd built his post-divorce life on the assumption that Dad would always be there with financial backup. That assumption was about to be tested. I want you to send Stephen formal notice that I'm exercising my right to demand immediate repayment of the house loan, I told James, $45,000 plus interest due within 90 days. And if he can't pay, then he'll have to sell the house or refinance to cash me out. Either way, he'll discover exactly how much his comfortable lifestyle has been dependent on his father's financial support. But the financial shock was just phase one of my response. While James prepared the legal notices, I was conducting my own investigation into Vanessa Chen, and what I was discovering was going to destroy her carefully crafted image as the perfect wife and stepmother. My first call was to my old colleague David Park, who worked in background investigations for corporate hiring. I'd known David for 15 years, and I trusted his discretion completely. "David, I need a comprehensive background check on someone who's become part of my family," I said. "I'm concerned about some inconsistencies in her story, and I want to make sure my granddaughter is safe." Child safety was the magic phrase that made background investigators take cases seriously, and David agreed to run a full report on Vanessa Chen. What he found was fascinating, and not in a good way. Vanessa had indeed worked in marketing, but her employment history was much more unstable than she'd led Stephen to believe. She'd been terminated from her last 3 jobs for what the records diplomatically called interpersonal conflicts with management, but which David's sources described as toxic workplace behavior and manipulation of office dynamics. More concerning was Vanessa's financial history. She had significant credit card debt, over $60,000 across multiple cards, and a history of late payments that suggested she was living well beyond her means. The luxury car she drove was leased, not owned, and she'd been consistently late on lease payments until 6 months ago. 6 months ago. Right when she'd moved in with Stephen and gained access to his financial resources. "Harold," David said when he called with his preliminary findings, "this woman appears to be in serious financial trouble. The timing of her relationship with your son coincides exactly with improvements in her credit and payment history. If you've ever suspected someone was using your family member for financial support, you'll understand the sick feeling I had as David's investigation confirmed my worst fears about Vanessa's motives. But David's most shocking discovery was Vanessa's previous marriage, which she'd never mentioned to Stephen. She'd been married for 3 years to a successful businessman in Seattle, a marriage that had ended in a bitter divorce just 18 months before she met Stephen. The divorce records painted a picture of a woman who'd systematically isolated her husband from his family and friends while accumulating massive debts in both their names. The divorce settlement had left Vanessa responsible for half the marital debt, which explained her precarious financial situation when she'd moved to our city and started looking for a new husband to solve her problems. Stephen wasn't Vanessa's first victim. He was her second husband, and she was following exactly the same playbook she'd used in Seattle. "David, I need you to contact Vanessa's ex-husband," I said. "I want to know exactly what Stephen is in for if this marriage continues." Robert Chen, they'd kept the same last name, which was another red flag, was more than willing to talk about his ex-wife once David explained the situation. "She nearly destroyed my relationship with my teenage sons," Robert told David during their phone interview. "Vanessa convinced me that my boys were disrespectful and needed better boundaries. She gradually pushed them out of our home with rules and restrictions that made them uncomfortable visiting. The pattern was identical to what Vanessa was doing with Emma and me. Isolate the husband from his existing family relationships, then position herself as the reasonable voice advocating for healthy boundaries and appropriate priorities. By the time I realized what was happening," Robert continued, "I'd barely spoken to my sons in 6 months, and they blamed me for choosing my new wife over them. It took 2 years after the divorce to rebuild those relationships. But the financial manipulation was even worse than the emotional abuse. Vanessa had convinced me to consolidate our finances completely," Robert explained. "She managed all our accounts, handled all the bills, made all the major financial decisions. I thought I was being a good husband by trusting her completely." "What happened?" David asked. She was systematically transferring money from our joint accounts into credit cards and loans that only had her name on them. When I finally got access to our financial records during the divorce, I discovered she'd accumulated over $80,000 in secret debt that I was legally responsible for as her spouse. $80,000 in secret debt. Vanessa had done this before, and she was already starting the same pattern with Stephen. The worst part, Robert continued, was discovering that she'd been planning her exit strategy from the beginning. She had opened bank accounts and credit lines that I knew nothing about, and she'd been building up resources for her post-divorce life while destroying our marriage and my relationship with my sons. When David finished briefing me on his investigation, I sat in my home office staring at the evidence of Vanessa's systematic manipulation of my family. She wasn't just a gold digger looking for financial security. She was a predator who specialized in isolating men from their families while stealing their resources, and Stephen was walking directly into the same trap that had destroyed Robert Chen's relationship with his sons. But Robert had discovered Vanessa's true nature too late to prevent the damage. I was discovering it while there was still time to save my son, even if he didn't want to be saved. The question was how to expose Vanessa's history to Stephen in a way that would force him to see the truth instead of dismissing it as jealousy from an interfering father. That's when I realized the perfect strategy. Instead of trying to convince Stephen that Vanessa was manipulating him, I was going to create a situation where Vanessa revealed her true character herself. The financial pressure from my loan demand would stress their marriage and force Vanessa to show Stephen exactly who she really was when money got tight. And I was going to make sure Stephen had a front row seat for her performance. I called James back with additional instructions. James, I want you to schedule a family meeting to discuss the loan repayment. Stephen, Vanessa, you, and me. I want to give them the opportunity to negotiate a payment plan if they can't pay the full amount immediately. That's unusually generous of you, Harold. I'm not being generous, I'm being strategic. Vanessa's going to reveal her true nature when she realizes that Dad's financial support isn't unconditional, and Stephen is going to see exactly what kind of woman he chose over his father. The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday afternoon. By then, Stephen would have received the formal demand for loan repayment, had time to check his finances, and realized that his comfortable lifestyle was about to evaporate unless he could come up with $45,000. More importantly, by then, Vanessa would have had time to process the fact that her new husband's father wasn't the pushover she'd assumed he was. If you've ever wanted to see someone's true character revealed under pressure, you'll understand why I was looking forward to that meeting with anticipation rather than dread. Vanessa thought she'd successfully removed me from Stephen's life and claimed his loyalty for herself. She was about to discover that declaring war on someone's father is a lot easier than winning that war, especially when the father has both the resources and the motivation to fight back. The woman who'd convinced Stephen that I was an over-involved parent who needed boundaries was about to learn that some parents are dangerous precisely because they're so involved in their children's lives. And Stephen was about to get a very expensive education about the difference between unconditional love and unlimited financial support. Friday afternoon arrived with the tension of a gathering storm, and I sat in James Morrison's conference room, watching my son and his wife walk through the door with expressions that told me everything I needed to know about how they'd spent the week since receiving my loan demand. Stephen looked exhausted and stressed, the kind of bone-deep worry that comes from suddenly discovering your financial foundation is built on quicksand. Vanessa looked furious, the carefully controlled rage of someone whose plans have been disrupted by an opponent she'd seriously underestimated. If you've ever watched people you care about walk into a trap of their own making, you'll understand the mixture of anticipation and sadness I felt as they took their seats across from me. "Dad," Stephen began, his voice strained, "I have to say this loan demand came as a complete shock. When you helped with the house down payment 6 years ago, I thought it was a gift. You signed a promissory note acknowledging it as a loan," I replied calmly, sliding a copy of the document across the table. "Your signature is right there, along with the terms specifying repayment upon sale or refinancing of the property." Stephen stared at the document like he was seeing it for the first time, which he probably was. During the chaos of his divorce, he'd signed dozens of financial papers, trusting his father to guide him through the process. He'd never imagined I might actually enforce the terms someday. "Harold," Vanessa said, her voice carrying that practiced sweetness that had fooled Stephen but had never fooled me. "Surely we can work something out as a family. Stephen has been under enormous stress lately, and this kind of financial pressure isn't good for anyone." "What kind of stress has Stephen been under?" James asked, playing his role perfectly. We'd rehearsed this conversation, knowing that Vanessa would try to position herself as the reasonable mediator, while painting me as an unreasonable father. Well, he's been working incredibly long hours at the architecture firm, trying to build his career while also being a good father to Emma and a good husband to me, Vanessa explained. Adding this kind of financial burden on top of everything else seems unnecessarily harsh. Stephen nodded along, clearly grateful that his wife was advocating for him. He had no idea that Vanessa's concern wasn't about his stress levels. It was about protecting her access to his financial resources. "The loan terms are quite reasonable," James said, reviewing the documents. $45,000 at 3% interest, which is well below market rates for an unsecured personal loan. Mr. Mitchell has been extraordinarily generous in not requesting payment for 6 years. "But we can't possibly come up with $45,000 in 90 days, Stephen said. "Dad, you know my financial situation. The business has been slow this year, and Emma's school costs, the mortgage, Vanessa's car payment. Stephen was listing his wife's luxury car lease as one of the financial burdens that made it impossible to repay his father. The irony was perfect. Vanessa's expensive lifestyle choices were preventing Stephen from honoring his obligations to the man who'd made that lifestyle possible. "What about refinancing the house?" I suggested. "The property has appreciated significantly since you bought it. You should be able to cash out enough equity to repay the loan." Stephen and Vanessa exchanged a look that spoke volumes. They'd already explored refinancing and something had gone wrong. "We looked into refinancing," Stephen admitted reluctantly. "But there are some complications with the current market conditions and—" "And what?" James pressed. Vanessa's composure cracked slightly. "Stephen's credit score has dropped in the past year due to some temporary cash flow issues. The banks are requiring additional documentation and collateral that we don't have readily available." Cash flow issues. Vanessa was admitting that Stephen's financial situation had deteriorated since their marriage, which aligned perfectly with what I'd suspected about her spending habits. If you've ever watched someone dig themselves deeper into a hole while trying to explain their way out of it, you'll recognize the satisfaction I felt as Vanessa's explanations revealed more than she intended. "What kind of cash flow issues?" I asked directly. Stephen looked uncomfortable. "Just the usual. Business fluctuations, Dad. Some clients have been slow to pay invoices, and we've had some unexpected expenses." "What kind of unexpected expenses?" The silence stretched uncomfortably before Vanessa answered. "Home improvements, mostly. We wanted to make the house more suitable for our family. New furniture, updated kitchen appliances, landscaping. Normal. Things that couples do when they're building a life together. Normal things." Vanessa had convinced Stephen to spend money they didn't have on luxury items while his business was struggling, then positioned this irresponsible spending as normal behavior for newlyweds. "How much did these home improvements cost?" James asked. "That's not really relevant to the loan repayment discussion," Vanessa said quickly. "I think it's very relevant," I said. "If Stephen can afford to upgrade his kitchen appliances and landscaping, he can afford to repay money he owes his father." "It wasn't that simple," Stephen said defensively. "The improvements were necessary for Emma's comfort and safety. The old appliances were breaking down, and the backyard needed work to make it suitable for a 6-year-old. Emma's comfort and safety." Vanessa had convinced Stephen that luxury purchases were necessities for his daughter's well-being. The same way she'd convinced him that his father's involvement in Emma's life was harmful. "Stephen," I said quietly, "Emma lived in that house for 4 years before Vanessa moved in. She never complained about the appliances or the backyard. She was perfectly happy with everything exactly as it was." "Children don't always express their needs clearly," Vanessa interjected. Sometimes adults have to make decisions about what's best for them, even if the children don't understand at the time. There it was, Vanessa's philosophy in a nutshell. Adults who barely knew Emma were better qualified to determine her needs than the grandfather who'd been part of her life since birth. "How much did you spend on these improvements?" I pressed. Stephen looked at Vanessa, clearly hoping she would answer. When she remained silent, he reluctantly admitted, "About $30,000, but it was spread out over several months, and we got excellent financing terms." $30,000 in home improvements, while Stephen owed his father $45,000 and couldn't afford to repay it. The mathematics of the situation were revealing Vanessa's priorities with crystal clarity. "So you had $30,000 available for home improvements, but you don't have $45,000 available to repay a 6-year-old debt to the father who made your home ownership possible in the first place," James summarized. The statement hung in the air like an accusation, which is exactly what it was. "The situations are completely different," Vanessa said, her voice taking on an edge that Stephen had probably never heard before. "The home improvements were investments in our property value and Emma's quality of life. This loan demand is—" She paused, clearly searching for the right words. "Is what?" I asked. "Is vindictive," she said finally, dropping all pretense of sweetness. "Harold, you're upset because Stephen and I set some reasonable boundaries about family involvement. Instead of respecting our decision as adults, you're using financial manipulation to punish us for not letting you run our lives." There it was, Vanessa's true character, revealed under pressure exactly as I'd predicted. The sweet, reasonable woman who just wanted what was best for the family had transformed into an angry manipulator who accused others of the exact behaviors she'd been exhibiting. Stephen looked shocked by his wife's tone and accusations. "Vanessa, that's not fair. Dad has been incredibly generous with us." "Has he?" Vanessa snapped. "Or has he been using his generosity as a way to maintain control over your life and Emma's life? Think about it, Stephen. Every time you've tried to make independent decisions as a husband and father, your dad has been there with his opinions, his suggestions, his financial assistance that comes with strings attached. If you've ever watched someone you love choose to believe lies about you, rather than confront the truth about their situation, you'll understand the pain I felt as Stephen's expression shifted from confusion to consideration. "Maybe Vanessa has a point," Stephen said slowly. "Dad, maybe the loan demand is about more than just money. Maybe it's about proving that you still have control over my life." The betrayal was complete. Stephen was choosing to believe Vanessa's narrative that cast me as the manipulative villain, rather than acknowledge his wife's obvious character defects and financial irresponsibility. But I'd expected this moment, and I was prepared for it. "Stephen," I said calmly, "let me ask you something. In the 6 years since your divorce, how many times have I demanded that you make decisions based on my preferences rather than your own judgment?" Stephen thought about it, clearly struggling. To come up with examples, how many times have I threatened to withdraw financial support when you made choices I disagreed with? More silence. How many times have I tried to undermine your relationship with Emma or interfere with your parenting decisions? "That's not the point," Vanessa said quickly, realizing that Stephen couldn't provide examples to support her accusations. "What is the point then?" James asked. "The point is that healthy families respect boundaries," Vanessa said. "Harold's insistence on being involved in every aspect of our lives isn't love, it's control. And now that Stephen and I are trying to establish our independence as a married couple, Harold is using financial coercion to force us back into a dependent relationship. It was a masterful piece of manipulation, turning every aspect of my generosity into evidence of controlling behavior." Vanessa was reframing 6 years of unconditional support as a calculated campaign of manipulation, and Stephen was nodding along as if her interpretation made perfect sense. "Stephen," I said, "do you really believe that I've been using financial support to control your life?" Stephen looked torn between his loyalty to his wife and his knowledge of our actual relationship history. "I don't know, Dad. Maybe not consciously, but maybe the effect has been the same. Maybe I have been too dependent on your help, And maybe that dependency has prevented me from becoming truly independent. Vanessa smiled with satisfaction. She'd successfully convinced Stephen that his father's love and support had actually been harmful to his development as an adult. In that case, I said, you'll be pleased to know that I'm prepared to help you achieve complete independence from any financial relationship with me. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a folder containing documents that James and I had prepared for exactly this moment. This is a comprehensive accounting of all financial support I've provided to you over the past 6 years, I said, spreading the papers across the table. Loans, gifts, services, and ongoing commitments. The total value exceeds $300,000. Stephen's face went pale as he reviewed the documentation. I'm prepared to forgive the entire amount and release you from all future obligations, I continued, in exchange for one simple agreement. What kind of agreement? Vanessa asked suspiciously. Stephen signs a document acknowledging that he's choosing complete financial independence from his father, and in return, I'll waive all debts and cancel all ongoing support arrangements. No more emergency loans, no more help with Emma's school, tuition, no more co-signed obligations, no more financial safety net of any kind. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Stephen would get what Vanessa claimed they wanted, complete independence from his controlling father. But he'd also lose the financial security that had made his comfortable lifestyle possible. Of course, I added casually, this would also mean that Emma's college fund contributions from Grandpa would end, and the trust fund I've been building for her would be redirected to other charitable causes. Stephen's head snapped up. Emma's trust fund? I smiled. Did I never mention that? I've been contributing to a college fund for Emma since she was born, currently worth about $120,000. But if you're choosing independence from my financial involvement, that would obviously include independence from any financial benefits for Emma as well. Vanessa looked like she'd been slapped. She'd successfully convinced Stephen to reject his father's ongoing support, not realizing that support included a substantial college fund for Emma that would disappear along with everything else. Stephen, she said carefully, maybe we should discuss this privately before making any decisions. But Stephen was staring at the financial documentation, finally understanding the true scope of what his father had been providing and what he was about to lose. If you've ever watched someone realize they've been manipulated into destroying their own best interests, you'll recognize the dawning horror on my son's face as he calculated the cost of choosing Vanessa over his father. The woman who'd convinced him that his father was controlling and manipulative had just revealed her own controlling and manipulative nature by pressuring him into a financial decision that would devastate his family's future. And Stephen was finally beginning to understand which one of us had really been looking out for his best interests all along. The silence in James Morrison's conference room stretched for what felt like an eternity as Stephen processed the full implications of what his father was offering. Complete financial independence, which is exactly what Vanessa claimed they wanted, but at the cost of losing a safety net worth over $300,000 and Emma's college fund worth another $120,000. Vanessa's face had gone through a fascinating progression of emotions: shock, calculation, and now barely controlled panic as she realized the trap she'd walked into. If you've ever watched someone's entire strategy collapse in real time because they got exactly what they asked for, you'll understand the grim satisfaction I felt as Vanessa struggled to find a way out of the corner she'd painted herself into. Harold, Vanessa said carefully, surely we don't need to make such drastic decisions today. Maybe we could arrange a payment plan for the loan, something reasonable that wouldn't put so much financial pressure on Stephen and Emma. Notice how quickly Emma had become part of Vanessa's argument now that she understood Emma's college fund was at stake. The woman who'd spent 6 months convincing Stephen that his father was too involved in Emma's life was suddenly concerned about Emma's financial future. I thought you wanted Stephen to be independent from my financial involvement, I replied. This seems like the perfect solution. No more loans, no more obligations, no more strings attached. Complete freedom from his controlling father. Stephen was studying the financial documents with the horrified fascination of someone watching a car accident in slow motion. Dad, I had no idea you'd been contributing so much to Emma's college fund. I set it up the week she was born, I said. $2,000 a month for 6 years, plus investment growth. I planned to continue until she turned 18, which would have given her close to $500,000 for college and graduate school. $500,000, Stephen repeated numbly. But if you're choosing independence, that money would be better invested in other children whose families appreciate educational support from their grandfathers. Vanessa looked like she was about to be sick. She'd successfully convinced Stephen to reject his father's support, not realizing that support included ensuring Emma's entire educational future. Her manipulation had backfired spectacularly. "Stephen," she said urgently, "we need to think about this logically. Maybe we've been too hasty in trying to establish boundaries. Family relationships are complicated, and maybe we can find a middle ground that works for everyone. A middle ground." Vanessa was desperately backpedaling, trying to undo 6 months of poisoning Stephen against his father, now that she understood the financial consequences of her success. But Stephen was beginning to see the situation clearly for the first time since his marriage. "Vanessa, you've spent months telling me that Dad's financial support was a form of control. You convinced me that accepting his help was preventing me from becoming truly independent. Now you're saying we should find a middle ground? I think I may have been overly concerned about maintaining appropriate boundaries," Vanessa said, her voice taking on that sweet tone again. "Sometimes, when you care deeply about someone's well-being, you can be overprotective of their autonomy." Stephen stared at his wife with growing recognition. "You're doing it again." "Doing what?" "Manipulating the conversation to get the outcome you want. When you thought Dad's financial support came without consequences, you convinced me it was harmful. Now that you realize losing it would hurt us financially, you're reframing the exact same support as potentially beneficial. If you've ever watched someone finally recognize the manipulation tactics that have been used against them, you'll understand the mixture of anger and embarrassment that crossed Stephen's face. "Stephen, that's not fair," Vanessa protested. "I'm trying to consider all perspectives and find the best solution for our family." "Our family," Stephen repeated. "Vanessa, when did Emma become part of your arguments? For 6 months, you've been telling me that Dad's involvement in Emma's life was inappropriate and confusing for her. You've systematically reduced his time with her, eliminated their special traditions, and convinced me that his influence was harmful to her development. I was concerned about consistency and structure. You were concerned about control," Stephen interrupted, his voice rising. "You wanted Dad out of our lives completely, didn't you? The boundaries, the Sunday dinner cancellation, the restricted visits with Emma. That wasn't about healthy family dynamics. That was about isolating me from the one person who might see through your act." Vanessa's mask was finally slipping completely. "Stephen, you're being emotional and not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in months," Stephen said, standing up abruptly. "Dad, I owe you an apology. A massive, humiliating apology." James was taking notes, professionally documenting what was becoming a complete reversal of Stephen's position. This conversation would be crucial if legal. Proceedings became necessary later. "Stephen," I said quietly, "I know Vanessa can be very persuasive. She's had practice." "Practice?" Vanessa's voice sharpened. "What's that supposed to mean?" I reached into my briefcase and pulled out David Park's background investigation report. "It means you've done this before, Vanessa. You've targeted divorced fathers, isolated them from their families, accumulated debt in their names, and planned exit strategies that left them financially devastated and estranged from their children." Stephen took the report and began reading, his face growing paler with each page. "This is about you, isn't it? Your previous marriage to Robert Chen." "Stephen, don't listen to this," Vanessa said desperately. "Your father hired investigators to dig up private information about me. This is exactly the kind of controlling behavior I've been trying to protect you from." "Robert Chen told the investigator that you destroyed his relationship with his teenage sons," Stephen continued reading. "The same way you've been trying to destroy Dad's relationship with Emma. That's completely different. You accumulated $80,000 in secret debt during your first marriage," Stephen read aloud. "You isolated your husband from his family and friends. You convinced him that his children were disrespectful and needed better boundaries. Stephen looked up from the report with dawning horror. You used the exact same tactics on Robert that you've been using on me. Word for word, Vanessa. The same complaints about family involvement, the same concerns about boundaries, the same financial manipulation. Vanessa was trapped, and she knew it. All her carefully constructed arguments about healthy family dynamics were revealed as recycled manipulation tactics from her previous marriage. Stephen, she said, her voice taking on a pleading tone, people's pasts don't define their futures. Yes, I made mistakes in my first marriage, but I learned from them. My feelings for you and Emma are genuine. Are they? Stephen asked. Or are Emma and I just more convenient than Robert and his sons were? How can you even ask me that? Because according to this report, you were $60,000 in debt when you met me. Your credit cards were maxed out, you were behind on your car payments, and you were facing potential eviction from your apartment. All of those problems disappeared within 6 months of moving in with me. Stephen set the report down and looked at his wife with complete clarity for the first time since their relationship began. You didn't fall in love with me, Vanessa. You selected me. You researched my financial situation, my family dynamics, my vulnerabilities as a divorced father, and you crafted a persona designed to make me fall in love with you. That's not true. Then explain the timeline. Your financial problems were solved exactly when you gained access to my resources. Your complaints about Dad's involvement started exactly when you felt secure enough in our relationship to begin isolating me from my support system. Your suggestions about home improvements and lifestyle upgrades began exactly when you'd established enough influence to guide my spending decisions. If you've ever watched someone systematically dismantle their manipulator's strategies using logic and evidence, you'll understand the satisfaction I felt as Stephen reclaimed his analytical thinking from Vanessa's emotional manipulation. Stephen, you're being paranoid, Vanessa tried one last time. Marriage is about partnership and compromise. Yes, I've benefited from our relationship financially, but that's what happens when two people build a life together. Partnership, Stephen repeated. Vanessa, name one sacrifice you've made for our partnership, one instance where you've compromised your preferences for my benefit or Emma's benefit. Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. In 6 months of marriage, she'd convinced Stephen to sacrifice his relationship with his father, Emma's relationship with her grandfather, his financial security, and his independence of thought. But she hadn't sacrificed anything for their partnership. I thought so, Stephen said. James, I don't want to sign any independence agreement with my father. I want to discuss repayment terms for the loan and rebuilding the relationship that my wife has systematically destroyed. Stephen, wait, Vanessa said desperately. We can work this out. I can change. I can be better about family boundaries and financial decisions. No, Vanessa, you can't change because this isn't about boundaries or decisions. This is about who you fundamentally are, someone who manipulates people for financial gain while convincing them it's for their own good. Stephen turned to me with tears in his eyes. Dad, I'm so sorry. I chose a woman I'd known for 8 months over the father who's loved and supported me for 42 years. I let her convince me that your generosity was manipulation and your love was control. I don't know how to begin making that right. You begin by rebuilding trust, I said. It won't happen overnight, and it won't be easy. But Stephen, you're still my son, and Emma is still my granddaughter. That never changed, even when you chose Vanessa over me. What about the loan repayment? We'll work out reasonable terms. Maybe you can refinance the house when your credit improves. Or maybe we can arrange a payment schedule that fits your budget. The goal was never to financially destroy you, Stephen. The goal was to help you see what Vanessa really was. Vanessa stood up abruptly. I don't have to sit here and listen to this character assassination. Stephen, when you're done being manipulated by your controlling father, we can discuss this at home like adults. We won't be discussing anything at home, Stephen said quietly. Vanessa, I want you to move out today. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. I've seen who you really are, and I won't expose Emma to any more of your manipulation. I won't let you isolate her from her grandfather, the way you isolated me from my father. Vanessa's composure finally cracked completely. "You'll regret this, Stephen. You think your daddy will always be there to bail you out. But what happens when he dies? What happens when Emma needs a mother figure, and you've thrown away the only woman willing to take on that responsibility?" "Emma doesn't need a mother figure who sees her as an obligation," Stephen replied. "She needs adults who love her unconditionally, and that's something you've never been capable of providing." Vanessa gathered her purse and stood in the doorway. "Fine, but don't come crawling back to me when you realize what you've given up, and don't expect me to make this divorce easy for you." After she left, Stephen collapsed back into his chair. "Dad, I've made such a mess of everything." "Messes can be cleaned up," I said. "The important thing is that you recognize the problem before it was too late. What about Emma? How do I explain to a 6-year-old that her stepmother is leaving?" "The same way you explained your divorce from her mother, by emphasizing that sometimes adults make mistakes, but the people who truly love her will always be there." Stephen nodded, wiping his eyes. Can we go pick up Emma from school?" "Together today. I think she'd like to see her grandfather again. I'd like that very much." As we left James's office, Stephen asked, "Dad, how did you know? How did you see through Vanessa when I couldn't?" "Because I'm your father," I said. "It's my job to protect you, even when you don't want to be protected, even when you choose someone else over me. That's what unconditional love means, Stephen. It doesn't end just because someone makes you feel unwanted." 6 months later, Stephen's divorce from Vanessa was finalized. She'd tried to claim spousal support and a portion of Stephen's assets, but James had used her background investigation and the recorded conversations from our conference room meeting to demonstrate her pattern of financial manipulation. She received nothing beyond her personal belongings. Stephen refinanced his house and repaid my loan in full, insisting on paying the full interest amount despite my offers to waive it. "Dad," he said, "I need to honor my obligations to you properly, so it's part of rebuilding trust." Emma's Saturday nights at Grandpa's house resumed immediately, and our Sunday dinners became a cherished tradition again. Emma never asked many questions about why Vanessa had left. She simply seemed relieved to have her normal family routines back. Today, Stephen is dating a wonderful woman named Carol, who teaches at Emma's school. Carol actively encourages Emma's relationship with her grandfather and includes me in family decisions naturally. The contrast with Vanessa's behavior is stark, and Stephen often mentions how much he appreciates Carol's genuine warmth compared to Vanessa's calculated charm. If you've ever had to fight for your family's well-being against someone who wanted to destroy it, you understand that the victory isn't in defeating the manipulator. It's in protecting the relationships that matter most. Vanessa thought she could isolate Stephen from his father and claim his resources and loyalty for herself. She underestimated the power of 42 years of unconditional love and the determination of a father who would never give up on his son. The woman who convinced Stephen that boundaries were necessary learned that some relationships are stronger than any manipulation tactics. Some bonds can't be broken by someone who's only known your family for a few months, no matter how skilled they are at emotional manipulation. And sometimes, the best way to prove your love for someone is to fight for them even when they don't want you to fight, because that's what real family does. If this story about protecting family relationships resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about standing up to manipulators and fighting for the people you love. Share your own experiences with family manipulation in the comments. Have you ever had to watch someone you care about choose a toxic partner over their family? Let us know how you handled the situation. Click on the next video to hear another story about exposing dangerous relationships and protecting family bonds. Thanks for watching, and remember, real love means fighting for people even when they push you away, because sometimes they need saving from themselves.